Hello, good day to you all, and podcasters, influencers or influencers, socialites, internet enthusiasts, worldwide web regulars, and the general populace. It's Lawrence here inviting you to another basic podcast which discusses Africa and the diaspora and all the issues and influences that occur as a result. Now, the topic I want to discuss today is the impact of Africans in Europe, African migrants in Europe and the UK, and the image they present as being of highly criminal activity and causing rampage. Now, in the European media in the UK, there's been reports indications that migrants are on the loose, basically involved in serious crimes, assault, rape, and robbery. Is there any claim that Africans are involved in most of these crimes to a larger extent than their population would suggest? And why is that? Also, is it the case that some of these migrants are coming from African countries and have a criminal tendency or are ex-criminals or ex-convicts? Because obviously the authorities would have no way of knowing that. Is there any means that the authorities can have to either contain the influx of migrants and also the crime rate? And are these people being ghettoized? In other words, are they all being dumped into the same impoverished areas, lacking any resources and resulting in them resorting to crime? Are the opportunities they pursue real or imagined? In other words, is there no job opportunities contrary to what they may think when they migrate and cross the border? Now, I know this is a sensitive topic, very, very sensitive. And it's important to separate media narratives, actual crime statistics, and what these statistics do or don't mean. First of all, in the first instance, the question being that are Africans or migrants generally responsible for most serious crimes in Europe and the UK? There's no real evidence that Africans or migrants as a group commit most serious crimes in the UK or broader Europe. The official data in countries like UK, Germany, Sweden, and France generally show that crime is committed by people from all backgrounds, and the majority is committed by native-born citizens, simply because of their larger number in the population. Some data sets show migrant groups may be over or underrepresented in specific crime categories, but this is obviously influenced by the age. Migrants tend to be younger males, a higher risk demographic, socioeconomic status, whether employed or unemployed, settlement location, which areas in the urban situation, whether deprivation is occurring, and policing intensity and reporting rates, the extent to which those crimes are reported. And importantly, foreign-born or ethnic group data is not the same as African. So we've got to distinguish that. Europe doesn't have one African migrant crime profile. Africans are extremely diverse. You've got North Africans, West Africans, East Africans, and so on, each with a very different migration history and outcomes. So when the media report says migrants are on the rampage, it is usually based on isolated high-profile cases, or it's a broad political framing rather than population-level evidence. The second item is that are migrants more likely to be criminal or ex-convicts? And in general, the migration systems finds that most migrants are not criminals. In legal migration pathways, work visas, study visas, asylum claims, people are often screened. So you can, to some extent, screen out criminals. Refugee asylum systems may involve people fleeing instability, not people with criminal records. So people are leaving because they're scared for their lives, not because they committed a crime where they're running away from. However, some irregular migration flows can include individuals with prior criminal knowledge, but there's no coherent or consistent evidence that this is the majority. Countries also perform background checks where possible, but war zones and failed states make verification difficult to refer back to a particular country. Like, for instance, Libya or Somalia, or even Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's inaccurate to assume that many migrants are ex-criminals. That is more of a political claim than a statistical reality. Does ghettoization or segregation increase crime risk? Yes, that's part of the problem. The question is closer to what criminology actually finds. When people, migrant or not, are concentrated in areas with high unemployment, poor housing, limited services, weak integration support, then you see higher vulnerability to gang recruitment, higher petty crime rates in some pockets, intergenerational disadvantage. This is not specific to Africans or migrants. This pattern has been associated historically with, for instance, Irish immigrants in the 19th century in the UK, Italian migrants in parts of Europe, the Turkish community in Germany, and rural to urban migration in many countries. It's fundamentally about poverty plus exclusion, not ethnicity. So it basically can happen anywhere to anyone. Now, why does media coverage feel like migrants are overrepresented in crime? There are several structural reasons. First of all, news bias. Violent crimes, obviously, involving migrants are more likely to be reported and politicized, easier to identify physically a migrant, particularly of African or Middle Eastern descent. Political framing. Immigration is a major electoral issue in Europe. Even where instances of migration are lowering, like in the United Kingdom, immigration appears to be stuck as an issue to the point of exclusion of most other socioeconomic problems. Visibility. Migrant communities are often concentrated in cities where crime is visible and recorded. Social media amplification. So basically the social media tends to exaggerate and spreads out any particular issue that occurs, any isolated case. This creates a perception gap between what's statistically happening versus what people are repeatedly exposed to. In some instances, you may see the same crime being reported several times, which then creates an impression that several crimes have been committed when it's actually the same crime being regurgitated through social media. And the question then arises, are Africans or are migrants in general taking jobs that don't exist or facing unrealistic expectations? This is partly true in some cases, but it's nuanced. Migrants often move because of economic hardship, conflict, family reunification, perceived opportunities in Europe. The outcomes depend on language ability. Can you speak the local language? English, German, Italian, French? Qualification recognition, if you have a qualification, is it recognized in that country? Legal work access, discrimination in hiring, which is quite common, particularly where people's names are pretty obvious as to their background, and the local labor demand. Now, demand in some jobs is higher in the retail and hospitality industry, tends to hire foreigners because there's a greater need and the labor costs are lower. So what happens is some successful integration into labor markets does occur in places like healthcare, logistics, construction, and services. Others struggle and may end up in informal work or welfare dependency. And a small minority may drift into illegal activity, but that's not normal. It's basically the last drop of migrants that end up resorting as a last resort to criminal activity. Now, the question being that what can the authorities do to reduce both irregular migration pressures and crime? Most evidence-based approaches focus on integration and prevention, not broad exclusion. At the border and migration level, stronger asylum processing systems are required, faster decisions to be made. Cooperation with origin countries is vital. Legal migration pathways are needed to reduce irregular flows. The people having a legal pathway are more likely to use it. Anti-smuggling enforcement through regular border patrols and checks. At the community level, housing distribution, avoiding over-concentration and spreading people out rather than concentrating them in one area, one part of the city or suburb. Language training and job matching. Language training, obviously, where people don't speak English, German, or French. Access to education for the youth. Important when people migrate at a very youthful level, at teenage level, and therefore, and particularly lack any formal training or have not completed their education. Employment pathways, apprenticeships, and recognition of skills. At the policing level, targeted policing of specific criminal networks must happen, and should not be ethnic profiling. It should be based on evidence. Intelligence-led enforcement against trafficking gangs, and community policing to build trust. So the police should interact with the community and develop trust in that regard to enable a free flow of information and evidence and the elimination of some of the criminal activity that occurs in the background. And in reality, the key that often gets lost is most research in Europe broadly finds migrants are not inherently more criminal. Crime risk is strongly linked to age, poverty reduction, exclusion, and urban concentration. The vast majority of low or law-abiding migrants are economically active or seeking stability. And where problems exist, they usually occur at the integration system failing, and not about a particular continent or ethnicity. So it's not a particular people are causing a problem, but it's actually the system to integrate them is the way the problem lies. So in general, there are nuanced differences between Africans. North Africans tend to be mostly Arabic background, and they have a long-standing migration links with Europe. Sub-Saharan Africans, typically Nigerians, Ghana, basically from East and West Africa. They tend to have longer migration routes, and they tend to be more asylum seeking, and they're more diverse because they can be both. They can be everything: students, work visa professionals, refugees, and so on. And so basically, the legal status in Europe there's a big difference between the North Africans, like I said. North Africans have a longer term residence linked to France, Spain, Italy in particular, and therefore have a family reunification, migration. And whereas sub-Saharan Africans simply apply for asylum and tend to be in a temporary or pending legal status, and the labor outcomes in a similar fashion based on which part of Africa they come from. So the employment rates tend to be mixed. Basically, North Africans tend to have a higher employment rate compared to the sub-Saharan Africans. And one key finding is that both groups face lower employment and occupational segregation. North Africans, like I said, show higher unemployment rates on average, and sub-Saharan Africans, there's more variety depending on education and country of origin. So, in conclusion, the rate of criminal activity is somewhat exaggerated and not quite correct. However, the ongoing debate on migration continues unabated in Europe and the UK. And hopefully a solution or solutions will be found which will ease the issue for everyone concerned. This is Lawrence. I'm signing off and glad to have had the opportunity to talk to you. And hopefully you've learned something about the plight of migrants in Europe. Thank you for your time and have a great day.